So here's the 11th Psalm, and I have preached in this Psalm before, but if you look up the record, you'll see it isn't the same sermon. In the Lord I take refuge. How then can you say to me, flee like a bird to your mountain? For look, the wicked bend their bows. They set their arrows against the strings to shoot from the shadows at the upright in heart. When the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do? The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord is on his heavenly throne. He observes the sons of men. His eyes examine them. The Lord examines the righteous, but the wicked and those who love violence, his soul hates. On the wicked he will rain fiery coals and burning sulfur. A scorching wind will be their lot. For the Lord is righteous. Now listen, he loves justice. Upright men will see his face. Brother Brian was reading this morning from the New Living Translation, which is, it's a super one. If you ever really want to get a kind of a poetic translation that is really easy to understand. I remember a kid saying to me one time, this can't be the Bible, I can understand it. And it really is a good translation. But if you were reading verse 3 in the New English or today's English version, it would say, there's nothing a good man can do when everything is falling apart. Now, what becomes of our faith in times like that? Do you know, my wife and I had an opportunity some time ago, several weeks ago, to go down to the beach with our grandchildren, and it was lovely. You know, you're sitting there on the beach and the sun's beating down on you and you're licking your ice cream and you're trying to get it into you before it all melts away over your knees and legs. And you know, it was nice. But that's really not all of life, is it? Because you spend 2 or 3 days and then you come home and, you know, you're back into where real life is. And looking around here, real life can be very, very tough. Sometimes we think it's ourselves. Man, I'm getting a raw deal and a rough ride. But the God's honest truth is it happens to all of us. And more often than we would like to admit. And thankfully, not everybody goes wearing their heart on their sleeve because you really don't want to hear all this stuff. But we've got to realize that times can be difficult and life can be very, very challenging. And I think particularly so as we advance in years. But what becomes of our faith in times like that? Now, I have to say to you, I don't know exactly. I have no idea in exactitude the situation that David was actually facing. But if you read through the psalm, it's very obvious that his life was under threat and his friends were very concerned about his safety. And so what happens? What happens to faith at a time like that? That's the kind of time we're addressing this evening. And David has, as he always does, some very helpful hints for us. Now, let me say again, I don't want to weary you in this, but you know, it's good to hear these things. The book of Psalms is my favorite book because the book of Psalms addresses life from an individual person's point of view who is a believer, and I would say who bears some responsibility in the things of the kingdom of God. And there's some wonderful heights that the psalmist rises to, but there are some desperate and desolate wildernesses that he finds himself in, and that is real life. I remember as a young man, I was in seminary and I was preaching in a little Baptist church mission in the back end of Ireland. It was down in County Carlow or something like that, and they were meeting in a community centre, and there was the mission pastor and his wife, and he had 5 kids, and I think there were 4 other people who were there. And I travelled about 250 miles on a camel to get there. At seemed like that because the roads were all two-lane roads, and they were rough. And I didn't drive at that time. And my father, who wasn't a Christian at the time, he would drive me around. But Father and I were at the mission pastor's home for lunch afterwards, as was the tradition. And it was heart-wrenching because they were obviously in a terrible state. And over lunch, the guy said to me, and I was a very young man at the time, he said, "You know, I haven't been able to pray for months. I haven't been able to read the scriptures except one book." So he told me it was the book of Psalms. And he said, "The only thing I know after reading through the book of Psalms several times is this, that God cares for me and he loves me." That made an indelible mark on my mind and heart. And I would suggest that it was probably that man's words that made me a student of the Psalms. And I can verify what he said. The book of Psalms, more than anything else, will tell us and convince us of the care of God for us and his love for us. And you'll always find them a warm and helpful resource. But the first thing to notice is the kind of advice that faith in this psalm is hearing. And of course, as is often the case in the Psalms, the advice to faith isn't always the very first thing that David or the psalm writer tells us about. But the first thing we hear about really is the whole crux of the matter, because the first thing we hear is where David's faith stands. And he says simply right at the beginning, "In the Lord I take refuge." Now those words are very, very important. They're totally detached from emotion and feelings. It is a statement of reality and will. And what David is saying there is the Lord is his anchor. And for one, he's not out on the sea. And the foundations around him may be destroyed, but what he's saying is his foundation remains. And that is the key to our Christian life. And it's something that we've got to continually take hold of. In the Lord I take refuge. If you take refuge in anyone else or anything else, it will fail you. And then what we have to do if we're Christians and we have a certain maturity is we have to come back regardless of the circumstances and of our feelings. And we have got to come to the point again where we plant ourselves in God and we take refuge in him. But then in the next line we see that someone else enters the picture and gives advice to David in the face of this obvious crisis that he's facing. And David, addressing the man, says, "How then can you say to me, flee like a bird to your mountain? For look, the wicked have you in their crosshairs. You have little time. You need to run now. They're hiding in the shadows. They're going to get you. Run. It's all over. There's nothing you can do. Everything is falling apart." And amazingly, the voice we hear in verses 1 to 3 is the voice of fear and the advice of fear. And it's important to see where this advice is coming from. The advice is coming from someone who cares about David. Someone who wanted to be by his side. Someone who actually wanted to be a support to him. Isn't that amazing? And it wasn't malicious, it was meaningful, and it was sincere. And so verses 1 to 3 aren't the advice of the wicked or some rival who's trying to usurp you or upset you or do you harm. They're the advice of a friend who is actually trying to help him. And yet for all of that, it's diametrically opposed to faith. And that's the problem in verses 1 to 3. They're sincere, they're caring, they're plausible, And that's exactly why real discernment is so important in times of trouble. Have you not ever been there yourself? Been in a kind of dilemma between a rock and a hard place? When you can't tell, you honestly can't tell what path you've got to take. Which one is the wise route or which is the disastrous? And how do you tell the difference between a Matthew 10 and 23 situation where we're advised, where the Word of God advises us, in fact urges us to flee in the face of Him in judgment? How do you tell the difference between Matthew 10 and 23 and what we're reading here in Psalm 11? Because there are times to run. When do you run and when do you stand your ground? In the words of that immortal bard, when do you fold them and when do you hold them? The most well-intended counsel may lead to living in fear and unbelief. So, how can we tell the faithful and the faith-lacking counsel from one another? Well, we're going to find out. But before we move on to verses 4 to 7 and the answer that faith gives, there's one more problem with the advice that David has been given. And what it is the assumption. The assumption behind the advice. And this is something that affects us all because we're all human beings and we all have this tendency. And the assumption is that safety and self-preservation are always the all-important issues. How can I look after myself in this? And oftentimes what happens, we value our safety and security more than we value God's purpose. Imagine if you were John the Baptist, down in the bowels there, and there's a great big carry-on going up above. And the next thing you know, he's ordered out of the place he's being held. And the glory of God and the purpose of God for John the Baptist, who is only months older than the Lord Jesus, and off comes his head. Do you think that's what he was praying for while he was in the dungeon? But it just goes to show that there are times when the purpose and the glory of God is served by what I might call our sacrifice and what we might see in human terms as our loss. Let me tell you a little story, a real-life story from OABC and OCS. Several years ago, I can't remember how long ago it was now, but we had to close the elementary school up to the 8th grade. And what happened was that 4 teachers lost their job. Can you imagine? Many of them had been working here for many years, and we had to face them and say, I'm sorry, but we're having to close the school. You're going to lose your job. And I remember one Sunday evening sitting down with them one by one and having to break the news myself that this was going to happen. And I brought them in one by one, and I sat them down and I gave them the bad news. And I said the church was going to do the best we could, and we gave each teacher $4,500, and subsequently we upped that to $5,000 through a love offering. But I said to each and every one of them, as I read them a psalm from the scripture, I looked them in the eyeballs and I said, look, this is a terrible thing for you right now, but let me make you a promise. God is going to turn this to your good. And if you can be patient and wait on Him, He's going to give you something better than what you have now. Within a couple of months, each one of those teachers had a new job. 2 of them in public schools where they more than doubled their salary, which isn't a bad gain. Where they had pensions. Where they had the vocation of their lives. One other, 2 weeks after she lost her job, was given a job back here again. And that was Kathy Spencer. She has been here for 30 years. So you see, sometimes we think of ourselves in self-preservation, that they're the all-important issues, but they're not. It is the purpose and the will and the glory of God that is our whole reason for living. And so I think of other friends, people who lost jobs and their homes. I think of my next door neighbour. He went through a bad divorce. His house went underwater. He was in a terrible state. And I didn't see him for about a year and a half. I don't know what he was doing. And I said, don't worry, Don. Believe me, you don't profess to be a believer, but let me say to you that if you can simply be patient and if you can trust God, you're going to find that things are going to turn out all right. Maybe not next week. But there'll come a time when you and I will meet again and you will say, Stuart, I remember you said that. Let me tell you what happened to me. And that's exactly what happened. He came to me after 2 years and he said, Stuart, I've lost the house. I haven't paid my mortgage for 24 months. But I've got $30,000 in the bank and I've never had that before. And that's what I'm walking away with. And with that $30,000, he was able then to begin to plan a more stable and steady way forward. We can trust in God. Even down to the most grievous things that happen to us. For many people in this church, mainly ladies, after decades of marriage, they lost their partner, their husband. And what a terrible loss. And it seemed that life would never go on. But in every case, God's grace was sufficient. And each of those ladies who are widows are making their way. Not that they don't miss the love of their life, but they're experiencing the love and the grace of God, enabling them to do what they thought they could never do, and that is to go on alone. Let's look into verses 3 and 7 and the answer that faith gives in the midst of all that. In very strong contrast to the advice fear gives, we hear the advice of faith. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord is on his heavenly throne. He observes the sons of men. His eye examines them. Now, if you're like me and you're in a very tight place and you read that, you may be tempted to say, well, bully-o, that's a fat load of use. That's what I was afraid of. God is light years away. But note the imagery, especially the throne and the eyes. David's words don't suggest that God is remote, but that he rules. His throne is not the place of slumber, but of supremacy. It doesn't suggest distance, it suggests dominion. The Lord's majestic transcendence only serves to emphasize his might and his authority. Let me tell you, I know you know what I'm going to say. We're brothers and sisters in the Lord. An intimacy so intense that for others it leads to judgment. When the Lord is the center of your vision, you see his character. You see, that's the whole thing. And that's why we've got to get to know our God. That's why the Bible is so important for us, because when the Lord is the center of your vision, you see his character. You begin to know who he is. Be still and know that I am God. The God who's been with you since before you were born, and who has gotten you out of every scrape you were ever in. He's the one who's with you now. No Johnny come lately. He's the God of Jacob, that ancient God. And you see just how just and powerful he is. And what David is saying to us is, your focus is where it needs to be when it's on the Lord. And the words of verses 4 and 5 indicate that God's judgment is based on careful testing and scrutiny. It's not chance. or the whim of a wisp. He observes. God observes, and God examines closely. Nothing's done in a rush. Nothing's done without good reason and purpose. And then in verses 6 and 7, you see how passionately just God is. We must come to terms with this, that God is just and what it means. Who wants to live in an unjust world? Tell me, who wants to go into an eternity that's full of injustice? For goodness sake, we live in it. We have plenty of law, but we don't have much justice. And the last phrase of verse 5 may cause you to do a rethink. I got into trouble about this some years ago with a very fine Christian lady. Might cause you to rethink that last phrase of verse 5. Rethink the dodgy theological cliche that says God hates the sin, but he loves the sinner. If you think that, you've got it wrong. Not in verse 5, he doesn't. David says God hates the sinner. And so he raises down fiery coals and burning sulfur. A scorching wind will be his or her lot. Now that is upsetting. I'm glad I'm not God. I don't think I could do that. I don't have the guts and I don't have the moral fortitude. But it's the Lord's righteous character that explains his righteous judgment. And one more time in these Psalms, the justice is our only solid comfort and hope. I hope you can see this. Brothers and sisters, if the righteous are to be delivered, then the wicked must be judged. My Christian friends, it's only when God comes and puts everything right that there can be a universal party, and only then can God's people have rest. Let me read you a wee piece from Psalm 96. It's verses 10 through 13 I'm reading. Say among the nations, the Lord reigns. The Lord is firmly established, it cannot be moved. He will judge the peoples with equity. Let the heavens rejoice, let the earth be glad, let the sea resound and all that is in it. Let the fields be jubilant and everything in them. Then all the trees of the forest will sing for joy. They will sing before the Lord, for he comes. He comes to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples in his truth. Listen. God's people will only have ultimate security and peace when they know that God is going to take out their oppressors. For until the enemy is destroyed, they will have no genuine security. It may make some people squeamish. I don't say, I'm right in there lapping it up and enjoying it. I don't. It frightens the life out of me because I want to make sure which side I'm on. But unless there is decisive judgment, there's no real salvation. Now, before I move on from faith's answer to what you can do when everything is falling apart, I got to bring you back to the keynote of verse 4, because it's there that David reveals the secret of a steadfast faith in a chaotic world. And the answer's simple. Everything depends upon your vision and mine. It's what you and I have our eyes on. You can either look at the wicked and their threats. You can either look around you in your little world and see all the people who are causing you problems, and you can get depressed and you can be afraid and you can get psychotic, or you can fix your eyes on the Lord. He's very big. Faith stands fast when in the midst of all that life throws at you, you fix your eyes on the Lord. I know it's only a 20th century chorus, and it's not one of my favorites, but it speaks wisdom. Fix your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of the earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord is on his heavenly throne. That's what anchors your foundations and mine when everything else goes to mush. It's your focus on the sovereignty of God. Now finally, you'll be glad to know, we couldn't leave the psalm without looking at the last few words for what they hold is the very assurance of faith. Here's what it says. Upright men, upright women will see his face. If the words of the counselors recommend safety through flight, then God's final words recommend security through fellowship. The genuine believer doesn't only want protection from God, he or she wants communion with God. Communion with God, knowing his presence in your life, knowing your place in his scheme of things. And such final and full communion is what David is assured of here. I know we don't like to think this way, we don't want to be so heavenly minded we're no earthly use. I get it. But what David says here is literally true for us too, as 21st century Christians. Yes, we enjoy the relationship with God that we have, but it's not face to face. And Peter puts it this way. He said, though we love him, we have not seen him. And I've never seen Jesus. Never. You, like me, have never seen Jesus. And yet, in spite of that fact, we would gladly confess that we love him. But the sight is coming. The sight is coming. And we need to remember that when all is dark and we seem to be doing little more than dodging the arrows of the wicked, what is Psalm 11 saying to us? It's saying to us that faith needs discernment to filter out the counsel of fear and despair. David is saying that faith needs vision to see the just and reigning God, because he's the big. I remember a guy from Zimbabwe. He was visiting with my church in Brighton, and he told us the name for God in the tribal language in South Africa was Nguna. I thought, that's lovely. What does it mean? He says the translation is the big. The big is on our side. The big is in control of the world and our world. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got you and me in his hands. And he's reigning. Our life may not tell that story or see that finale. But finally, David is telling us that faith needs hope that one day we shall see him face to face. And we will. And we will. And I think what David is telling us in his own little way is this: that we are on the winning side. And whatever we have to face in life, the terrors, the losses, that when we stand on that great day, we'll be pleased as punch. Pleased as punch. And we will see, as we look over our lives, that all those things that happened to us and grieved us and hurt us and harmed us, in the light of what God has prepared for us, they are only momentary glitches. Now, they're not at the time. But in the light of eternity, when we see God and we are with God and we are in his ultimate kingdom, what a joy it will be. And what David is saying is simply this: all of this should be helpful when everything in our little world is falling apart. Because fall apart, it will from time to time. I was sitting with my son and his wife and kids Friday evening, I think it was, and I said to Ashley, Ashley, life's tough and then you die. I like to provoke people. And she said, but it's also very beautiful, is it not? And I said, well, tell me about it. What's beautiful about it? She told me, well, your husband, your mom, your dad, your kids, those times, those beautiful times. And of course she was right. Let me say it again. Your life's tough, and then you die. But however good or trying life has been, it is absolutely nothing in comparison to what it will be. And I can't write you a list. It's going to be like this, it's going to be like that, it's going to be like that. I can't do it, but what I can say is this. I can just say what my granddad said. He said, Stuart, it's 1,000,000 times better than your wildest imagination. And you know what? I'll settle for that.